Hi, this is Paul. I was away for the weekend. I was up in the Seattle area, and I had a chance to really listen to this conversation. And as I really listened to this conversation, I really liked this conversation. Part of what's different about this conversation is that Jordan and Jonathan have known each other for a number of years now. They've done a number of projects together. They are friends. And part of what that sort of relationship allows is a much deeper level of conversation. They're both quite candid and open, and they are sharing their thoughts and ideas with each other. There's no posturing or competing. They are just talking things through. It's also what makes this conversation a little bit difficult to follow, because what both of them bring to this conversation is a whole wealth of other conversations. Now, I want to do a little bit of introduction for Jordan Peterson, which might seem weird to many of you because he of the two is probably the best known figure. But I think, while many people don't understand Jonathan Pageau hardly at all, I think many people misunderstand Jordan Peterson and what his project is. Way before Bill C-16 or Jordan Peterson's fame, he was wrestling with the role and place of Christianity in our civilization. And you can go to little talks that he gave a long time ago where he appreciated, I think, via Jung, because Jung, of course, was a Reformed minister out of Switzerland. He appreciated that Christianity provided something to our civilization that allowed it to flourish and to succeed. And a lot of that, Jordan Peterson is a social scientist, and so he looks for signals. And so when he looks at things like success economically, success politically, success in sort of the narrative competitions in the world, he saw Christianity as succeeding and thriving, and he wanted to understand why. And of course, he had some indoctrination as a youth in United Church of Canada. He lost interest in it as a young teen. He's told this story before, but he's for a long time sort of trying to piece things together. Now, you can go back and watch Jordan Peterson's conversation with Tim Lott. It's just a little short clip, but it's an important clip. And obviously, this is Peterson before he in some ways professionalized. This is him in a collarless shirt in his office at home. And if you remember all the way back to the early days of 2016 and 2017, we would see Jordan sort of doing similar to what I'm doing here in my office, talking with people.
Are you a Christian?
I suppose the most straightforward answer to that is yes, although I think it's let's leave it at yes.
Well, there's
now a little bit later, just recently, he talked to Alex O'Connor, and he identified as a Christian existentialist or an existentialist Christian. I don't remember which way he did it. It was interesting because Michael Schellenberger recently, in one of the little street epistemology things that Peter Boghossian does with Schirmer, identified himself in the same way. And I think that's a fairly good one. But you can see already this is something that Jordan's been wrestling through for a long time.
I'm a bit dissatisfied with that because there are so many kinds of Christians, and I would never imagine that you were a very literal-minded Christian.
Well,
and of course, what Tim Lott means by that is, now we're going to get into the stuff that was in the Dawkins conversation. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe that Jesus physically rose again from the dead? Do you believe doubting Thomas could touch Jesus' wounds and that Jesus could eat a fish after the Romans, who were very good at killing men, killed him? So he was not just the goats, etc., etc., etc. We talk about these kinds of issues fairly often. And so the idea here is, well, surely you're not one of those kinds of Christians, which sort of sets up the rationality rules Jonathan Pageau crying game moment when Jonathan Pageau reveals to Stephen Woodford that, yes, in fact, Jonathan Pageau does believe in the resurrection. But Jordan's, at this point, and still today, wrestling with the question. And again, Jordan is disparaged and admonished by atheists and Christians alike for the answer that he gives, but I'm not entirely dissatisfied with the answer that I gives, because I think he's being truthful. But where that answer is so helpful for us is the answer that he gives doesn't mean, this sounds so Petersonian, doesn't mean what you think it means, because of everything that's changing in our world in terms of how we view the world, how we talk, how we understand the nature of reality.
There are truths other than the literal that perhaps are more truthful than even literal truths. There are
Again, this answer has not really changed. He will say basically the same thing to Richard Dawkins. He has more to say about it. His answer is fuller now, but it fundamentally hasn't changed.
Many kinds of truth, and I don't mean that in a postmodern way, actually. But the truths that govern behavior and the truths that emerge from facts are not the same truths.
Well, do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question. And the reason is because, okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed
in a body. And
in a body.
In a body. And,
yes.
And it was a physical body, and then it was on earth.
Yes. That it was on earth, and that was literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue, which is a lot different than saying I don't believe that it happened.
That's very interesting.
I can't explain why. When I get to the New Testament in my biblical lectures, I'll spend like 6 hours trying to explain what I think about that. But
so the Gospel Seminar will be coming out in December, and so we'll get to hear a whole lot more about this, but he and Jonathan get into it.
The things I have come to learn over the last 15 years in particular is that the world is a very, very strange place. It's far stranger than we think. And what we don't understand about consciousness and its relationship with the body would fill many books. And you could say the same thing about our relationship with time, and perhaps corporality and vulnerability and death, for that matter. So I don't understand the structure of being well enough to make my way through the complexities of the resurrection story. I would say it's the most mysterious element of the biblical stories to me, and perhaps I'm not alone in that. I mean, it's the central drama in the Christian corpus, let's say. But I don't believe that it's reasonable to boil it down to something like, do you believe that or do you not believe it? It's not, it's I don't know the limits of human possibility. I don't know.
What he says right there is so important. You have to keep that in mind when you listen to Peterson and Pageau talk about this. And part of the reason why that's so important is because this is really complex, because ostensibly what the current epistemic regime wants to say is, we do know the limits. We do know the limits in all kinds of ways. The limits are obvious about what people can and cannot do. The limits are obvious, and the line of demarcation between those limits is what we call the natural and the supernatural, and we know where that line is and what it means. That is the iron box of secularism. That is what is there. Now, so my friend Luke Thompson, who I've not yet clipped, and he's a little upset about that, but he's not really upset about that. He noted, he always raises Peter Rollins, and he noted what John Vervaeke said at this moment in the conversation, and I think my friend Luke is correct that I need to pay more attention to this moment in the conversation. I was pushing John on an old conversation that John and I have been having about so-called two worlds mythologies, because I think it's also the case that we're really unclear and unsure what on earth we mean by all of this. And my point was much more from less an ontological point of view than a pastoral point of view, that from what I see with people, let's call it the hope of heaven. Now that's it's a tremendously complex thing, and I know many of you hear it just as such, but it really is. And I know I sound very much like Jordan Peterson. It's an incredibly complex thing to talk about, because even hope of heaven is not necessarily geographically correct. We might say a little better understand might be hope of new heavens and new earth. But this is the point I put to John Vervaeke. Cannot talk that we cannot have an eschatology apart from an immanentized eschatology that becomes utopia.
I want to challenge you on that.
Yeah, good. Please. That's why we're talking.
Yep. And so I think the Enlightenment thought it was doing that. And what the Enlightenment did was just replace the two worlds mythology with a whole bunch of dichotomies. And a dichotomy is not a conceptual distinction that's pragmatically useful. A dichotomy is a deep ontological division. There is the subjective world of value. There's the objective world of fact. There is the mind. There is the body. There is science. There is religion. There is theory and data. I don't think it went away in the Enlightenment. I think it went underground and went unconscious. And it gives us what, by the way, I strongly recommend this book by Frank Gleitzer and my good friend Evan Thompson, The Blind Spot. It put us into we create the worldview from which we do science is not the worldview of science, right? And that is a profound performative contradiction. That's what all those dichotomies do. They put you into the blind spot, just a whole system of performative contradictions. I don't think the Enlightenment cut it off. I think the Enlightenment internalized it in an unconscious and unhealthy way as all of these dichotomies that literally blind us to reality in a profound way. Now,
I've got another book I've got to read. But he's mentioned this book before, and this book has come across my consciousness Congress before, and I know, I think I put it on not on my physical pile in my room, I put it on my mental pile, because I heard Evan Thompson, I think, talk with John Vervaeke about this before, and I probably even clipped it in a video because it is a powerful point. But both Luke Thompson and John Vervaeke are right in that I have to think about this a lot more. I mean, part of what happens after these conversations is these people give me things that I have to think about and things I have to sort of process, because I think John Vervaeke is right that the Enlightenment did not do what, for the most part, we have all thought the Enlightenment did. And so this question that Peterson is wrestling with here with Timothy Lott is a hugely important question. And Peterson is right that the reason it is difficult is not because of sort of a facile embrace of one tribe over another across the natural-supernatural distinction, even though I don't think that is inconsequential, that choice between the two tribes. But the world is such that it's very difficult to talk about it in a helpful way. And I think that, in fact, is in many ways biblical, because so often, underneath many of the questions that people bring Jesus, such as the question of, is there marriage in the resurrection? one little analogy I find often helpful for questions of this nature. Imagine you before you were born. What did you know of the world after you were born? In fact, it took a very long time for you to grow in knowledge of the world after you were born, even though you were growing at an incredible rate for the first number of years. And most of the things that you learned in the first few years were so absolutely vital and so were building blocks upon which almost everything else would grow, but you remember none of that. And the only time you probably have a sense of that will be in the future if you are unfortunate enough to lose your mental faculties or lose your physical capacity, because that's a lot of what we grew early on. And talking about things like the resurrection of Jesus are in some ways that strange. That doesn't mean they are not accurate or in some ways intelligibly let's just say intelligible in some ways. And one of the things I need to do at some point, I won't have the time to do this today, I need to do it at some point, is go back into C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, which I think has been, to me, such a helpful book. To go back into his book, Miracles, and look at that section on the ascension. Because Lewis walks through something that's very subtle there. And what we know now in terms of 4E cognitive science, as John Vervaeke keeps talking about, compared to what C.S. Lewis could know in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when he did a lot of his work, I think not only strengthens Lewis's position, but forces us to deal with a whole lot more. All right. So what Jordan Peterson's project has been all along, and Jonathan addresses him on this directly in this video a number of times, is to build from the bottom up. Many times I've likened Jordan Peterson's mission as something akin to the Tower of Babel. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but it is similar to the degree that Jordan again and again says, when I talk about the Bible, I try to talk in ways that are defensible from when I put my hat on as a scientist. That has been his mission from the start. He has, for the whole time, basically been saying, in a way, and again, I don't mean this in a disparaging or dismissive way, can I get to the other side without Kierkegaard's leap? I think in many ways that remains where he is. Now, his wife and his daughter, I think, sort of looked at him at some point and said, hey, I'll jump it. And both of them did for their own reasons, to the best of my knowledge. I don't know either of them personally, but just by paying careful attention to conversations and such. Jordan, in a sense, keeps trying to say, I'd like to see if I can build a bridge. But again, this much clipped moment where Jonathan, again, his friend, says, jump.
Christ from a psychological perspective, and the critic, my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because this, well, it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like,
that dividedness inside. Rafe Kelly, you can look at the Northwest Jory videos when he gave his talk, talked about the fact that he had this experience. And again, see Nathan Jacobs talk about the unaffiliated with respect to what many of them feel they need in order to make that leap. He said, you know, my maybe I can find the meme. A little meme I made for it. Rafe Kelly's right brain, Rafe Kelly's mouth says, I'm a Christian. Rafe Kelly's right brain looks at that and is like, yeah. Rafe Kelly's left brain looks at that in disgust and horror. And, you know, in many ways, Jordan has been working on this problem in himself for a while now, a very long while.
Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. You know, that's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's too... partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you... Because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
I had a conversation today with Vesper Stamper, and it is currently in No Wait, No Ads, because again, when I have a conversation, I put it in No Wait, No Ads right away, because some of you are really eager to have it right away. So I put it there, and it was a tremendous conversation. It was a tremendous conversation. But you know, as Nathan Jacobs says, people are looking for an experience. They're looking for an experience that, again, I'm going to use this word, supernatural, because of the nature of the box that our culture has surrounded, the prison for our minds that the culture has put around us. And I mean that so deeply, because I see its bars. And even for people like myself who have grown up in a Christian home, and that for all of my life I can easily talk about all the articles in the Apostles' Creed without having any internal pause at all. I so often see what Peterson is talking about there is like, if I really believed it, and so often I think that's right, because I disbelieve it, and I disbelieve it with my actions. John Calvin says in his commentary to the book of Daniel, to the degree that we worry, we doubt God. And it's like, well, there you go. And I'm not really a worrier. But here Vesper talks about an experience that she had that pushed her over the line. And again, this correlates with Alex O'Connor when he's studying theology at Cambridge and he's realizing that this, or at Oxford, realizing that this Christianity isn't sort of sloughed off, and he tries to sort of get into it, but he doesn't have the experience. And Douglas Murray says, I think I would need to hear a voice. And then Rafe Kelly has this experience at the waterfall.
But it wasn't until later that year in June that I had an experience where a friend of mine...
So she had started attending a youth group with a friend of hers and, you know, listening, but she was into sort of all the things that a young girl of her situation might be interested in, Wicca and all of that kind of stuff. No, nowhere near Christianity, but the youth group people seemed genuine and nice, so she went.
Mine was, it was pressuring me to sleep with him, and I didn't want to. But I had no sort of inner moral grid to say yes or no either way, you know? So I was so uncomfortable. It really, really knocked me out, this decision. And so it happened to be youth group night. So I asked his mom to take me to youth group. So that was my ticket out of that situation. And I get to youth group and I couldn't go in. It was, I don't know if you know the story of Mary of Egypt, Saint Mary of Egypt, but she was curious about, the church. There was some relic or something, but she was a prostitute. And she gets to the door of the church and she like literally can't go in. Like something is preventing her, blocking her physically from going in. She can't. So it was like that for me. Like I was in the vestibule of the church and I could not go down to the basement where the youth group was. I felt so empty, just so empty. Like I didn't know if I was coming or going. My life didn't, I don't know. It's hard to even put into words, but it was this sense of utter annihilation, really. So I'm sitting there on the steps between the sanctuary and the basement. There's, these two stairs going up and down. And I'm bawling my eyes out and just praying that nobody, well, not praying, but just hoping that, nobody would come and see me. And sure enough, one of these leaders came to get something from upstairs and saw me sitting on the steps and just sat with me and let me cry. He didn't ask me to tell him what was wrong, nothing. He just sat with me for a long time and finally said, do you want to go in the sanctuary? Because they're going to be coming up soon. And, if you need to be alone, I'll just sit with you in there if you want. So we went in there and again, sat with me while I just was crying without words and just bawling my eyes out. And somewhere in that time, he asked me this precise question and he said, do you want Jesus? And immediately I said yes.
Wow.
I didn't know why I was saying yes. I had no reasons. He didn't present me the four spiritual laws or anything like that. I just knew, I knew in my knower, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
that the answer was yes. And as soon as I said yes, I had a vision. I was, transported.
Yep.
And this wasn't necessarily unusual for me because of the practice that I had been in for 3 years. But I was at the foot of the cross and I just saw his feet. I couldn't see up any further than that. It was just his feet with the nails. And I just started crumbling pieces of paper and hurling them at his feet, just like with fury and rage. And the papers would pile up and pile up. And as soon as they would touch his little toe, all the papers went away. And I did it again. And, in this vision, I did that about 3 times. And then I came out of it. And the gentleman, asked me if I had a Bible at home. And I was like, what, why would I have a Bible? And he just handed me a pew Bible and he said, just compliments of the church. And I went home that night and I read the Bible all through the night. And it was like this is in here. This is in here. I can't believe it. Was just this mind-blowing experience of that this is the greatest thing I've ever read or encountered in my life, is this truth. And it took me a while to kind of disentangle myself from my previous beliefs, but yeah, nothing stood up to the gospel. Everything paled in comparison to that.
So I play that as this is Jordan is astride this in some ways, or he's leaning. And again, I think about Rafe Kelly at a branch, and he's like, you're working up to this jump, and Jordan's been working up to this jump, and Pageau's sitting on the other side, and it's come on, Jordan, jump. And in some ways, interestingly enough, if Jordan says, I believe in the resurrection, I believe in the virgin birth, if Jordan can recite the Apostles' Creed and say, this I believe, well, that means he's jumped. And that's why I say, when I talk about the nuance of these things, I'm not dismissing speak with your voice, if you can profess in your heart, I'm not dismissing that, but I'm saying that there's sort of an overly simplistic way to think about it, and there's an overly complexified way to think about it, but there's a right way to think about it, and we are there. So all of that to set up this conversation, and I hope I can go through this whole conversation, because the whole conversation was really good, and it all holds together. It really does. But it is not a super easy conversation. Let's get started.
Well, Mr. Pageau, let's start by comparing books.
All right.
You've just published a new book.
Yeah.
So tell us about the book, and tell us about what you're doing with this series and with your publishing arm in general.
Yeah. And so, we talk a lot about the problem with culture that we have now. And, I really wanted to do something positive, which is, if we're noticing that our stories are being captured, that they're being turned into ideological weapons, why not take them back and present them in a beautiful, celebratory way. And so that's the take that we're doing. And so we're making these books unapologetically beautiful, beautifully illustrated, hopefully powerful storytelling, beautiful cover, cloth binding. And so people can, we're publishing it ourselves. We want to keep total control over the quality and the beauty of the book. And so people can go to my website, symbolicworld.com, and go to the store. We're offering the books now. We're selling it out of our own Shopify. And also, if people want, they can just sign up for a mailing list, and we're giving out free PDFs of some of the books that we're publishing, because we want to, in some ways, we want to have control over the narrative. And so we want to bring it together as much as possible so we can tell the stories that we want to tell and not be subject to others.
So you have published Snow White?
Yeah. So this is the latest one. It's Jack and the Fallen Giants. We published Snow White. We're doing Jack. And then we're going to do Rapunzel, The Valiant Little Tailor. We're doing girl fairy tales, boy fairy tales, but in a way that will bring them together.
Fluid identity fairy tales?
Yeah, we could.
Okay, but before they go there, one of the people at the Connecticut conference gave me a Martin Shaw quote, which was really helpful. I think I got it from there. Basically, your fairy tales are the ways that your culture sort of passes on itself to the youth, and that is true. And it's interesting that fairy tales have been, for the most part, abandoned and sometimes disparaged. It's also important to remember that. So, back when I started a bunch of this, I thought, I should get up to speed on fairy tales, and so then you start poking around in like Grimm's fairy tales, because those are some of the early ones. But fairy tales, once but even by the time the brothers Grimm get a hold of them, it's already in some way sort of a modern appropriation of them, because part of the cataloging and canonizing of them is a very modern move. Now, this is extremely hard and frustrating for us to imagine, because fairy tales are in many ways an oral tradition, and oral traditions have a degree of fluidity and flexibility that modernity intentionally sought to domesticate. And of course, one of the chief ways that was done was the printing press. So now suddenly, instead of having texts that are copied and sometimes changed or illuminated, you have every copy is the same. That plays on our imaginary. Now, obviously, these books are every copy is the same, but it's really helpful to remember. Now, what Jonathan's going to do is say that these are sort of retelling of these fairy tales. And that retelling of these fairy tales is important in recognizing that it's a retelling, because now we cannot help but notice that these have fingerprints on them. Whereas, someone even sent me an email or a message helping me find this. This whole not made by human hands thing in a universal history way is super important because it sort of highlights kind of a folklorist, organic sourcing of things that has a valence to it that a printed page doesn't have. You know, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about Greek mythology, because actually a lot of the stories that we would sort of categorize as Greek mythology come to us not only through the Greeks, but also through the Romans. And one of the things that you realize is that these stories keep getting retold and retreaded and moved along. Now, in many ways, our Hollywood story makers are doing that with us now. You always see these reinterpretations of stories. And of course, Disney did that with these fairy tales. And it's really a tremendous crime that Jordan Peterson has commented that what he'd really love to do is a full video treatment of Pinocchio, but he can't because of corruption in our culture that has kept way too many things, including, especially, and because of Disney, a lot of his old stuff behind their intellectual property rights, when in fact he took them out of public domain and put them behind his firewall and keeps them there for decades upon decades. And after a certain amount of time, they should be released back out for, that's the whole idea behind copyright. Anyway, there's a living tradition to this that frustrates modernists, both by how traditionalists embrace them and how postmodernists today embrace them. And so what Jonathan Pageau is doing is participating in this tradition, but he is using printing presses. And again, it's not that you mustn't use them. It's just really important that when you do use them, you understand what is happening. Boy, that's probably what I said is inscrutable to many of you, but it's a really important point in terms of understanding his project, as well as the project of trying to rescue storytelling.
Little Taylor, we're doing girl fairy tales, boy fairy tales, but in a way that will bring them together.
Fluid identity fairy tales?
Yeah, we could. I'm tempted to do Little Red Riding Hood, actually. I'm actually tempted to do that, maybe off series with a black cover or something, you know, to kind of talk about the problem of
the wolf,
and also the
in grandma's clothing.
Yes,
that wolf.
Yes, that wolf.
Yeah.
And we might do something about that, but for now it's mostly just celebrating. And these characters also will start to, as the series goes on. There's 8 books. It's called Tales for Once and Ever, and the characters will start to cross over into the different fairy tales, and we're going to have like a kind of symphony.
So you can see he is in many ways participating in the older traditions, and he's doing it as people have been doing it in the modern period. He is doing it with an understanding of the tradition, and that, okay, well, here's something. He's doing something similar to what Disney did, and I still have to get my hands on these books. When he did his Kickstarter for one of them, I signed up, but I don't think I signed up, so I didn't get the book or something like that. But these books look fabulous, and I really want to support the effort because I think it's important.
Of the fairy tales come together. So
age range?
I think like from 4 years old to all the way to adult, because one of the things we want to do is we notice that in the postmodern fairy tale, there's like a child reading and an adult reading.
Yeah.
Like in Shrek, for example.
Yeah.
But the adult reading is mostly just dirty jokes and sexual illusions.
Okay, so again, Shrek is participating in that. And Hollywood, in some ways, keeps alive this tradition because whenever they do a sequel, or better yet, a remake, they are participating in this tradition because every remake, then the screenwriters and the directors and the producers, they take liberties with the original story, and they are working in that area of storytelling.
And what we want to do is to have an adult level reading, but that's based on insight, which is, can we help the grown-up who heard these stories when they were young see something in them that they never seen before. You know, and so we connect them to ancient myth, to the Bible in ways that's very subtle. A kid won't notice, and they'll just enjoy the story. It's an adventure story. But hopefully the adult will be able to kind of get a glimpse of something more in the fairy tale.
And of course, Tolkien does that very, very well. Now we have to go through well, this is just a ad within it. Here we go.
Speaking to these stories, or to story in general, from propagandization. You know, my students used to ask me, it was an intelligent question too, and it was a postmodern question when I was teaching my Maps of Meaning course in particular. How do you know that what you're teaching isn't just another ideology?
Yeah.
And that is a postmodern question, because the postmodern assumption, with a Marxist twist, is that it's all ideology. It's ideology all the way down, and everything's a power game. And so you can't claim to
Okay, and so you might rephrase that and say everything is propaganda. It's a person in power looking to secure their own private welfare at the expense of the public by shaping a narrative that will disempower, disable, take away the agency of the public and lead them down a road that it's basically my welfare at everyone else's expense. And an ideology is sort of weaponized thought that at a very subtle level produces that. That's the postmodern suspicion.
step outside it, let's say. Now, you and I have talked about that a little bit, because one of the distinguishing features seems to be the willingness to tie the interpretive enterprise into the historical tradition, to the deeper historical tradition, maybe even into the biological tradition.
Yeah. Okay. If you tie it to a historical tradition, you very much lose the sense that there's an individual who is manipulating the story for their own personal well-being, because that individual, of course, only lives or dies in a short amount of time. Chad has Elizabeth Oldfield on, and Chad has just introduced her to his concept of the cosmic burrito.
Just me eating the burrito and think I'm the creator of the burrito.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I purchased it. My identity as a consumer, I'm entitled to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think a huge amount about formation, and it's just a fancy word of who we're becoming, but it's in sort of the Christian tradition, it's who we're becoming quite deliberately, on the assumption that our circumstances and our world and our culture and the media we consume will be forming us. And that is mainly, unintentional and passive, but we can be intentional and active in seeking to be.
Okay, so that formational is unintentional, passive. It's forming us. In other words, if in fact this ideology or propaganda is forming us, we are being victims of some mastermind who is doing such a thing, and so she's paying very attention to formation.
Be formed by the good, essentially, that what we can choose what we pay attention to, what stories we immerse ourselves in, ritually and collectively, and that's essentially what church is, and also who we're in relationships with. And the kind of my journey of trying to have this intuitive sense of, I think this thing is sacred, I think this is some deep truth about the universe that I want to live into, is sort of taking me further and further to seeing that ambient background individualism and how easy it is just to assent to it and to make decisions based on that framework. And it takes a huge amount of energy to go, I don't believe that. I don't believe in individuals. Actually, I think it's a lie. I think we are persons in relationship. We are so interconnected that we are miserable, and we cannot flourish when we're working on the logic of I am this isolated, rational consumer in the world, so slowly self-actualizing through all my free choices. It's just bullshit. It's just not true. And so I think things like moving into living in community, being part of a congregation even when it's hard and annoying, my marriage, my children, my friendships, those things, as wanting to remember that that's what lasts. that's what people will hopefully talk about at my funeral, and everything else is just like earning a living. Fine.
Well, just quickly, and I want to hear a little from Kyle. I've tried this before because actually one of my online friends, Jacob, here brought up the idea about the individual is it's a lie, and that's the first time I ever heard that, and I was like, wait, what? But when you really start to, as you just laid out perfectly, I mean, yeah, but if you ever really want to like kind of like have people who are not only strangers, but even some of your friends look at you like you have lobsters coming out of your face, just tell them that there's no such thing as an individual.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, what? And that's how like you.
But now you can see how, okay, so this is all well, maybe it's not a project of an individual, maybe it's a project of a group. And before you know it, you keep following this and you begin to recognize that there are agencies through time that have agendas and efforts that are moving through us. The Bible calls them principalities and powers. But okay, so we're looking for something that's not an ideology. How do we know that it's not an ideology? Well, we go back through history, and if you can keep going back through history, well, then you're certainly transcending and outliving individual people, and maybe you're transcending you're going back through, okay, it's not the Democrats or the Republicans or whatever, and whoever those things are. And then he says, well, you want to go all the way down through history in terms of through people collecting and forming and changing. And so we want to get down to the biological. So before, but now you're going to have to wrestle with the epistemic implications of the assertions of these layers. And again, I'm really sorry for the really strange talk here, but there are assumptions built in on every level because you cannot do any thinking without assumptions. And to note the assumptions is not necessarily to deny the assumptions or even to call them into question, but just the importance of noting what you're doing. Now, again, for Peterson, this is important because I said he's building sort of a Tower of Babel. And so he's got his scientific worldview, which has certain assumptions about the nature of creation and assumptions about, well, the biological comes first, and then, out of biology comes. See, this is where things are going to get screwy because if consciousness is a product of biology, and I don't think Peterson is definitely sold to that position as many are, because there are other positions that say, in fact, biology is a product of consciousness and design. And so we can get into the whole design question. But just wanting to note the layers here.
So, but I'd like to hear your take on that so that you could explain what you're doing.
So I think that the fairy tales themselves, they have in them a trace of human memory. In some ways, because these stories are old and because they've been told for who knows how long, over and over, refined.
We have evidence it's 15,000 years for some.
Okay, now remember, in the Dawkins video, the one moment of connection was when Dawkins and O'Connor just for a moment glimpsed the fact that Jordan was drawing a relationship between divine revelation and historical emergence. Now, when I go back to John Vervaeke's conversation, at least the take on the Enlightenment, now that point that John made is a hugely important point, and there's a ton of stuff around it. But part of what the great Christian traditions have always said is, and I usually summarize it as the God of creation is the God of redemption, is that historical emergence is not necessarily the enemy of divine agency. Okay? That God works through history. And this gets into God number one and God number two. You might say that it is God number one that works through emergence, and God number two is emanation from above. And so you have these two, and again, you can look to my conversation with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. Jonathan, if you go back through the talks with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke, this emergent emanation conversation has been going on all the way back to the beginning, and so has the two worlds mythologies. In many ways, we're continuing the conversation that we've had, and that's why, again, it's important when you look at a conversation between these two, you will have a far better understanding of this conversation if you can sort of follow along the conversation that they've been having, at least the public conversation that they've been having over the last 8 or 9 years, however long they've known each other. And much of the public conversation is a little bit shorter than that, and obviously only episodic. But this question of emergence and emanation, this question of, do Christians ostensibly say God did this when to our eyes it is the product of some historical development? Most Christians will say absolutely. That's in fact what we're talking about much of the time. And we have words like providence that I know I was making a whole bunch of you nervous, but then when I said providence, a whole bunch of you settled down. Because once I say that Christian word, you say, oh, of course, God is working through when the time was fully ready for Jesus to come into the world. Again, we're coming into Advent. So most Christians do not believe God's working through history, through historical processes, through biological processes, are necessarily antithetical to God's agency. Okay? Yet, to completely subsume God in those processes is pantheism, basically, and is not what the biblical Christianity entails, because the thing begins it all begins with God. In other words, God comes first. So, but God puts into motion, and God continues to work from both ends, basically, I would argue.
And so I think that because of that, they contain in them a pattern of memory which is beyond ideology, which is something like the very pattern of human attention itself. Mm-hmm. The things that we care about without even knowing we care about them, which is why sometimes fairy tales are so strange at the outset. When you look at the surface of them, they're strange, but for some reason they're extremely captivating. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that by staying close to the fairy tale, and doing it in a celebratory way, because the ideological fairy tales are often very cynical. They're very cynical in the way they approach the tale.
Ironic.
Yes, ironic and cynical and inverting.
And holier than thou.
Yeah, definitely.
Intellectually superior, Luciferian, presumptuous, manipulative.
Well, and also you're right. In some ways, the author's thinking that they're above the story.
You bet.
And that they are now.
And there it is. The author's thinking they're above the story. And this is sort of the telltale moment of sort of the modern move. Now, the modern move had been with us all along, but it tends to get accentuated in modernity, where I, by virtue of a certain way of imagining how the world works, can, with my ability, mentally transcend it and look through it. Again, when I have more time, I'm going to need to make a video on C.S. Lewis's treatment of the spirit of the age in his book, The Pilgrim's Regress.
Commenting on the story.
That's the sin of not honoring your father and mother.
Yeah.
Right? That makes everyone into the slaves of servants.
And so in some ways, what we want to do is more like the way the ancient stories were told, which is we dive into it and we celebrate it. And then we also cast light on certain threads or certain insights that maybe people hadn't noticed before. That's how the ancients would tell it. They would tell their version of, let's say, Ulysses crossing the waters, and then they would branch off a little bit from the main story in order to help you kind of see more clearly what the story is about. And that's what...
And even talking about Ulysses, instead of, what was his Greek name? Odysseus, never forget the cultural The cultural colonizing power of Christianity is because right away the early church moves in translation. And translation is a very risky business. Sam Tiedemann just recently did an excellent conversation with John Baer about John doing a critical edition of a work from one of the Cappadocian fathers, and John Baer noted it needed a new translation because the old translation was 150, 170. It's a 19th century translation. And, well, why would you need a new translation? A modernist would say, well, translating, machines can translate. Yeah, they can. But not like we can. And so what Jonathan Pageau is saying is we are entering into this, we are participating in this tradition. Let's not say storytelling, because I think that is a little, that doesn't really get at it. Let's say story stewardship. We are participating in this tradition of story stewardship that allows us to be true to the story while playing with the story. You need to be able to bend the story but not break the story. You can break the story. So you have to be true to the spirit of the story. You have to keep the narrative thread. You have to follow the thread. George MacDonald, Purdy and the Goblins, Purdy and the Princess. You have to hold on to the thread, but the thread is a very flexible thing, and you can sort of keep your cultural listeners if you can hold on to the thread. And then the question is always, don't break the thread, hold on to the thread.
We're doing. It's what people will totally recognize these stories. Like it's the story you heard when you were a child, but we hope
Right, so that's the first part of it not being propaganda, is that you're not deviating from the central tradition.
Yeah, the person will recognize it.
And so again, so now we're using all these words. Okay, we're not deviating from the tradition. Now a modernist will really complain. And it's no, the more I think about this, it's no mystery that postmodernity really had its advent through literary criticism. Because in some ways, in literature, you have all of these dynamics, and they're most easily read, they're most legible. Because I kept hearing how Jordan Hall was using that word legible in the way that he was. They're most legible when you're looking at it through a written, published story tradition. You can create a critical text. What do you mean by a critical text? A critical text is something that has the variants noted. So if I am, let's say, as we are moving our way towards Advent, I will increasingly be in the New Testament. And once you're into New Testament work in Greek, you very quickly wind up in with critical text, because you're trying to figure out, okay, there are other readings of this text. How are we to handle these other readings? So what Jonathan is saying is that we, with these books, we are playing in this tradition. And so and Jordan says, okay, but you have to stay in the tradition. Now sometimes, of course, traditions get forked. And then you have to deal with those consequences. But
then why would they read my version rather than the Grimm version?
Yeah,
right? That's the question. And the answer is something like there are certain threads in the story which are more relevant at certain times. And so you can bring out those threads, kind of show them in a manner that are secretly hidden in the story, because the story is so patterned on human attention. So like in Snow White, for example, right, the idea that this image of the witch looking into the mirror, right, that it's something like a cell phone, that it's something like social media looking back and telling
Narcissus pool.
Exactly. But you can
that witch, that old woman, she's concerned about losing her attractiveness. And so what she's out to do essentially is destroy young female beauty and fertility.
Now, I've made this point many times, the interesting role that Jonathan Pageau has played in whatever it is we've been doing over the last 6 years. And Jordan is doing it right here too. They're taking something that is implicit in the story and they're bringing it into another level of speech. Let's say they're turning narrative into prose. They're explaining. It's not a bad thing to do. We need it. It's a super helpful thing. But we should always pay attention to what happens when we explain. Ian McGilchrist, in his preface to The Master and His Emissary, I think it was in the preface, or perhaps it was the little paper that he did before. See, this is why I'm not an academic. I don't have any patience to get all these footnotes right. You can do it in the comments if you want to. But there's a flattening that happens when you explain. And it's a very interesting sort of flattening, because you are translating, but you're translating in a way that sort of imbibes of the heady wine of modernity, because you think, if I can translate it, then I can domesticate it, then I can wield it, then I can own it, and then then I can wield and own others through my explanation. Go back to my talk with Chris Green at that breakthrough moment when he talks about the fact that he doesn't use these words. We push up to the top of the hierarchy those who can explain and listify and create listicles, and then we really love those who have large listicles, and who sort of the libido dominante in the explanatory world, where Grimgears is going to make one heck of an AI generated thumbnail for what I just said. So we have it's this libido dominante, which is of course what Augustine uses to describe it's such a great term. This way of sort of this acquisitive, aggressive desire really to push God off the throne and replace him. Because we can see from nowhere. We can see from above. We have the monarchical vision. Now that I can take this narrative, which is much closer to life, explain it, distill it into my little listicles. Now suddenly I can employ these listicles, but we never can. It's an illusory trick, because we are not capable of it, because of where we are in the created order. Okay.
Right, and that's the eternal witch that does that.
There you go.
The enemy of youthful, healthy femininity. Right, that's a tale for our times.
In the
that's
name,
for sure.
in the name of this weird tack on beauty, or beauty as power, you could say.
Beauty and power, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the idea, is to take these stories that everybody already knows, but to just slightly, and to do it very subtly, so that for a child, like most of the children will just see a beautiful story with wonderful characters that is adventurous. But nonetheless, it's just slightly bringing people into that awareness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, obviously my insight into the Bible stories is something that I wanted to bring into the fairy tale. And so, for example, in this, obviously people who can recognize the fact that it's Jack and the Fallen Giants means that I'm slightly alluding to the Nephilim and the idea of the giants in the story of Noah, for example.
And he's doing that because those of us who have been listening to him have already heard the explanation. Again, I am not. The power to explain is analogous to the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Because once we learn this great power of explanation, it's funny because very quickly we imagine that the great power of explanation is superior to the power of story, when the reverse is actually quite true. But to understand the relationship between story and explanation is important, because explanation, again, is, let's use McGilchrist, explanation is emissary work. I'm taking elements of this story and I'm putting them in my little epistemic Amazon thought boxes. There's this explanation. There's this explanation. And we love them because we can count them and we can write them and we can explain them, and we have aspirations that with these things we can colonize the world and make it our own, which of course goes back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When in fact, we grow so tired of these epistemic Amazon boxes, and story somehow enlivens us. And that way, the epistemic Amazon boxes are masculine and the story is feminine. The story has way more potential, but it's not. And this is where tradition is funny, because tradition, you have to serve a tradition. If you break a tradition, it's quite likely that tradition will devour you, or those that the tradition holds will take you out, or at least sideline you. And that's, and to understand this is to sort of have a degree in the faith, a faith of God, number one, providential emissarian development, that traditions can grow and change while remaining living and whole and God breathed.
Example, nothing explicit, but some of the patterns and the tropes that I'm using have to do with this idea of the fallen angel, or these principalities that can be corrupted.
So there's this idea that psychologists developed a long while back when they were trying to determine whether or not a psychological description was real.
Okay. This begins a whole nother section that I am not going to have time for. So I can do the thumbnail and I can put all the notes for the videos that I've made. Because now Jordan is, this is where, okay, this word real. Now, in Spanish, so we have all these roads here because, of course, the Spanish got here first and the missions got here first. And there's the Camino Real. And you might translate, they say, Camino, that's road, and Real, that's the real road. It's the royal road. Wait a minute. What's the relationship between Real, Spanish, Camino Real, the royal road, and real and royalty? Reality is about governing. What does it mean to govern? And this is very much what this conversation is about. But Peterson is looking at the real, and what happens in the real in modernity is what the real is: material, cause and effect, emergent outcomes, because governing comes from below. In a reductive materialist system, governing comes from below. And a lot of what this conversation has been saying, oh no, just did it for vacuism. No. Governing is from above. That's the definition of above. But there is a governance from below, and that governance is really resistance. More on this when we get back to this, and that will have to be another day. So I was really jazzed by this video, but again, what happens is I start on this thing and I'm only 12 minutes into it, and I skipped even the first 6 minutes. I've only done 6 minutes of the video, and I've probably got an hour of content. Woe is me. Anyway, leave a comment.